The confetti cannon exploded in a burst of pink glitter that caught the afternoon sunlight like tiny fragments of shattered dreams. Laura watched the metallic pieces float down onto the manicured lawn of her mother-in-law's estate, each speck catching the light before settling onto perfectly trimmed grass that probably cost more to maintain than most people's monthly rent. She pressed her hand instinctively to her 20-week belly, feeling the gentle flutter of movement that had become her constant companion, her secret conversation partner in a world that suddenly felt very loud and very wrong. Preparing and narrating. This type of story took us long efforts and hard work, so if you are enjoying the story, please consider subscribing to our channel. "Pink means girl," shouted her sister-in-law Jessica, clapping her hands together with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for lottery winners or surprise proposals. The gathered crowd of 30-some family members and friends erupted in the expected chorus of congratulations, their voices creating a wall of sound that should have felt warm and celebratory, but instead pressed against Laura's chest like a weight. But it was the silence that followed that made her blood run cold. Margaret Whitmore, Mrs. Whitmore to everyone except her son David, and Dr. Whitmore to the hundreds of patients who had passed through her psychiatric practice over the past 25 years, stood frozen beside the smoking confetti cannon. Her perfectly applied coral lipstick had formed a thin line of disapproval, and her manicured fingers gripped her champagne flute so tightly that Laura could see the white of her knuckles through her foundation. The silence stretched for exactly 4 seconds. Laura knew because she counted them, a habit she'd developed in therapy sessions when clients needed space to process difficult emotions. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, 3 Mississippi, 4 Mississippi. Then Margaret's voice cut through the afternoon air like a scalpel through skin. "Well," she said, her tone carrying the clinical detachment she'd perfected over decades of delivering difficult diagnoses, "I suppose we're hoping for a miscarriage now." The words hung in the air like toxic smoke. Someone's champagne flute actually fell to the ground. Laura would later learn it was David's cousin Emma, who was 8 months pregnant with her own first child. The glass shattered against the flagstone patio with a sound that seemed to punctuate Margaret's statement with an exclamation point made of crystal in disbelief. Laura felt the baby kick, as if responding to the sudden spike in her heart rate. She watched her husband David's face cycle through confusion, embarrassment, and then something that looked almost like resignation. Not anger, not shock. Resignation. As if this moment, this horrible, impossible moment, was somehow expected, predictable even. "Mom," David said quietly, but his voice carried no force, no real objection. It was the tone of someone going through the motions of propriety rather than genuine outrage. Margaret turned to face her son, and Laura saw something in her expression that made her stomach drop even further. It wasn't embarrassment or regret at having spoken so cruelly in front of 36 witnesses. It was satisfaction. The kind of cold satisfaction that comes from finally saying something you've been thinking for a very long time. "Don't mom me, David," Margaret said, setting down her champagne flute on the nearest table with deliberate precision. "You know exactly what I mean. This family has a reputation to maintain, standards, and bringing another woman into this world when we already have quite enough complications." She gestured vaguely in Laura's direction without actually looking at her, as if she were indicating a piece of furniture that didn't quite fit the room's aesthetic. The crowd began to shift uncomfortably. Aunt Patricia, David's father's sister, cleared her throat and announced something about checking on the catered lunch. Several couples began gravitating toward the house, their conversations unnaturally bright and forced. But others remained, frozen by the social car wreck unfolding before them, unable to look away from the collision of cruelty and family dysfunction. Laura's best friend Maya, who had driven 2 hours from the city to be here, stepped closer. Maya was the kind of person who wore her emotions on her sleeve and her heart on her tongue, and Laura could see her struggling between the impulse to unleash verbal warfare on Margaret and the knowledge that doing so would only make things worse for Laura, in the long run, maybe we should, Maya began, but Margaret cut her off. Oh, please don't pretend this is shocking, Margaret continued, now addressing the remaining crowd as if she were delivering a lecture to medical residents. Look at the statistics. Single, mothers, broken homes, the cycle of dependence and dysfunction. And with Laura's background. She paused delicately, letting the implication hang in the air like a bad smell. That was when something inside Laura snapped. Not the dramatic, explosive kind of snap that leads to shouting matches and thrown objects. This was quieter, more profound. It was the sound of a bridge burning, of a door closing, of a decision crystallizing in her mind with perfect, terrible clarity. She had spent 2 years in graduate school studying family therapy. She had written her master's thesis on intergenerational trauma and the way toxic family systems perpetuate themselves across decades. She had sat across from hundreds of clients and helped them navigate the devastating aftermath of family rejection, conditional love, and emotional abuse disguised as concern. But she had never imagined that her own daughter would be the target of such calculated cruelty before she was even born. The baby kicked again, stronger this time, and Laura found herself speaking in the calm, measured tone she used with her most volatile clients. What exactly do you mean by my background, Margaret? The use of her mother-in-law's first name was deliberate, a small act of rebellion that didn't go unnoticed. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, but she seemed almost pleased to have been invited to elaborate. Well, dear, let's be honest. Your mother was a teenage pregnancy who never married. Your father was absent. You grew up in government housing, relied on food stamps, attended public schools, and now you're following the same pattern, getting pregnant to trap my son into marriage, thinking you can use a baby to secure your place in this family. The accusation was so breathtakingly wrong, so fundamentally twisted, that Laura almost laughed. She and David had been married for 3 years. They had planned this pregnancy, talked about it for months, celebrated when the test finally showed 2 lines. But she realized with growing horror that Margaret had constructed an entire narrative that cast Laura as a gold-digging manipulator and her unborn daughter as an inconvenient obstacle to the family's social standing. This pregnancy was planned, Laura said quietly. David and I have been trying for over a year. Of course you'd say that, Margaret replied with a dismissive wave. But the timing is very convenient, isn't it? Right when David's partnership track was becoming secure, right when the inheritance discussions were beginning. Very convenient indeed. David finally seemed to find his voice, though it came out as little more than a whisper. Mom, that's not... Laura isn't... But Margaret wasn't finished. She had 25 years of psychological training and a lifetime of privilege to draw upon, and she wielded both like weapons. And now it's a girl, she continued, her voice taking on the lecturing tone she used with particularly challenging patience. Another generation of women who will grow up thinking they deserve things they haven't earned, expecting handouts and special treatment. Look at what that mindset has done to society. Look at what it's done to families like ours. The cruelty was so pure, so distilled, that several people actually gasped. Maya stepped forward as if to physically shield Laura, but Laura held up a hand to stop her. Something was happening inside her, something that felt like awakening and armor forming at the same time. She looked around at the faces surrounding her, some shocked, some embarrassed, some clearly uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene. David's father, Robert, stood by the garden trellis, his expression unreadable, but his posture suggesting he'd heard variations of this speech before. David himself looked like a man watching his life implode in slow motion, caught between the 2 women but seemingly unable to choose a side. It was then that Laura noticed something that would later prove crucial. Jessica was recording everything. On her phone. She had started recording when the confetti cannon went off, expecting to capture joyful reactions to the gender reveal. Instead, she had captured something far more significant, a moment of such raw, unfiltered toxicity that it would eventually change multiple lives in ways none of them could imagine. "I need to leave," Laura said quietly, and began walking toward the house to collect her purse and keys. The crowd parted before her like water, no one quite meeting her eyes, but everyone watching her movement with the fascination reserved for natural disasters and public humiliations. Behind her, she could hear Margaret's voice rising slightly, as if she couldn't quite believe that her audience was walking away mid-performance. "Oh, wonderful," Margaret called after her. "Run away when faced with difficult truths. That's exactly the kind of emotional maturity we can expect from someone of your background. That's exactly the kind of behavior you'll teach your daughter." Laura stopped walking. For a moment, the only sound was the gentle rustle of pink confetti, still drifting down from the trees where it had caught in the branches. When she turned around, her voice was steady and clear enough to carry across the entire patio. "You're right about one thing, Margaret," she said. "I will teach my daughter something. I'll teach her that family isn't defined by blood or money, or social status. I'll teach her that love isn't conditional on meeting someone else's expectations. And I'll teach her to recognize toxic people and remove them from her life before they can poison her sense of self-worth." She paused, letting her hand rest on her belly again, feeling the reassuring presence of the life growing inside her. "But most importantly, I'll teach her that she was wanted from the moment we knew she existed, that her parents celebrated her, planned for her, and loved her unconditionally. Something I'm beginning to realize not everyone in this family can say about their own childhood." The silence that followed was different from before. This wasn't the shocked silence of people witnessing unexpected cruelty. This was the profound quiet that follows a truth so fundamental that it reshapes everyone's understanding of the situation. Margaret's face had gone pale beneath her makeup, and for the first time since Laura had known her, the older woman seemed genuinely speechless. Several people were now openly staring at her with expressions ranging from disgust to dawning comprehension. The social dynamics of the gathering had shifted completely, and Margaret found herself isolated in her own backyard, surrounded by people who were seeing her differently than they ever had before. Laura walked into the house, collected her things, and drove home in silence. The baby was active during the entire drive, as if responding to the adrenaline still coursing through Laura's system. She found herself talking aloud to her daughter for the first time, explaining what had happened and making promises about the kind of world they would create together. It wasn't until she was home, sitting in her favorite chair with a cup of herbal tea, that she allowed herself to cry. Not for the cruelty she had endured. She had survived worse in her childhood and developed thick skin as a therapist. She cried for her daughter, for the grandmother who had rejected her before birth, for the complicated family dynamics that would now shape the early years of her child's life. But she also felt something else, a fierce, protective clarity that she had never experienced before. She was going to be a mother, and that meant everything had to change. Every relationship, every boundary, every decision would now be filtered through the lens of what was best for her daughter. And that included the difficult conversation she would need to have with David when he finally came home. The house felt different when she walked through it that evening, as if the day's events had somehow altered its molecular structure. Pictures that had once seemed like evidence of a happy marriage now looked like artifacts from someone else's life. The nursery they had been decorating together took on new significance. It would be a sanctuary, a place where her daughter would be celebrated and loved unconditionally. As the sun set, Laura found herself thinking about her own childhood, about the ways her mother had protected her from her father's absence and society's judgment. She thought about the strength it had taken for a 17-year-old girl to raise a child alone, to work multiple jobs while attending night school, to create a home filled with love despite having very little money. Margaret had tried to use Laura's background as a weapon, But sitting in her chair with her hand on her belly, Laura realized it was actually her greatest strength. She knew what it meant to be resilient. She knew how to create stability in unstable circumstances. She knew how to love fiercely and protect what mattered most. The baby kicked again, and Laura smiled through her tears. "We're going to be just fine," she whispered. "Better than fine. We're going to be extraordinary." Outside, the pink confetti from the gender reveal was probably still scattered across Margaret's perfect lawn, a reminder of the day everything changed. But inside her home, Laura was already planning the kind of life she wanted to build for her daughter, one founded on respect, kindness, and the revolutionary act of unconditional love. The phone rang twice that evening. First David, whose conversation would prove to be shorter and more decisive than either of them expected. Then Maya, who was already making plans to drive back up and help Laura process what had happened. But between those calls, in the quiet spaces where Laura sat alone with her thoughts and her baby, something profound was taking shape. It was the beginning of a story that would eventually reach far beyond one family's dysfunction, touching the lives of people she had never met and creating ripples that would spread in directions she couldn't yet imagine. The pink confetti was just the beginning. 3 days later, Laura sat in her office on the 4th floor of the Riverside Community Mental Health Center, staring at the intake form for her next client, while the events of the gender reveal played on repeat in her mind. The familiar weight of her credentials felt different now. Licensed clinical social worker, master's in family therapy, 2 years of specialized training in trauma-informed care. All of these qualifications that had once felt like armor now seemed inadequate protection against the reality of raising a daughter in a world where grandmothers could wish for miscarriages at celebration parties. The knock on her door interrupted her spiraling thoughts. "Come in," she called, automatically straightening her posture and arranging her face into the expression of calm competence that her clients needed to see. Elena Rodriguez entered with the careful movements of someone who had learned not to take up too much space in the world. At 19, she carried herself like a woman much older, her dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail that emphasized the sharp angles of her face. This was their 4th session together, and Laura had been working to build trust with a young woman whose family history read like a case study in generational trauma. "Sorry I'm a few minutes late," Elena said, settling into the chair across from Laura's desk. "My mom called right as I was leaving, and you know how it is." Laura did know. Elena's mother was a woman who used guilt like a surgical instrument, precise and devastating. Elena was the first person in her family to attend college, and every achievement was met with a complex mixture of pride and resentment that left Elena questioning her right to succeed. "How are you feeling about your presentation today?" Laura asked, referring to Elena's senior thesis defense that was scheduled for later that afternoon. Elena shrugged, but Laura could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands twisted in her lap. "I keep thinking about what my abuela said last week, about how education makes women forget where they come from, how it makes us think we're better than our families." The conversation continued along familiar lines, Elena's struggle to honor her family's sacrifices while also creating a life that looked different from theirs. But as Laura listened and responded with her usual therapeutic interventions, part of her mind kept wandering to her own situation. How would she navigate her daughter's relationship with the Whitmore family? How much of Margaret's toxicity would seep into her child's understanding of her own worth? After Elena left, walking taller than when she'd arrived, armed with strategies for managing her family's reaction regardless of how her defense went, Laura found herself thinking about the parallels between her client's situation and her own. Both involved women trying to break cycles of conditional love and emotional manipulation. Both involved families where achievement was simultaneously celebrated and punished. Both involved the complex dance of loyalty and self-preservation that defined so many family relationships. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. "Can we talk tonight?" "I've been thinking about what happened." Laura stared at the message for a long moment before responding. "Of course. I'll be home by 6. But she wasn't ready for that conversation yet. She had 2 more clients that afternoon, and each session reminded her why she had become a therapist in the first place. There was something profoundly meaningful about sitting with people in their pain, helping them untangle the knots that family dysfunction had tied in their hearts and minds. Her 3 p.m. appointment was with Marcus, a 42-year-old construction worker whose father had never told him he was proud of him. Marcus had built a successful business, raised 3 children, been married to the same woman for 15 years, but he still carried the weight of paternal disapproval like a stone. In his chest, still found himself seeking validation from a man who had been dead for 3 years. "I know it doesn't make sense," Marcus said, his voice thick with emotion. "He's gone, has been for years. But I still find myself doing things and thinking, Dad would hate this, or Dad would think I was weak for crying. It's like his voice is permanently installed in my head." Laura nodded, making notes while simultaneously feeling the baby shift position inside her. The irony wasn't lost on her. Here she was, helping clients heal from the wounds their parents had inflicted, while simultaneously worrying about protecting her own child from similar damage. "What do you think it would feel like?" she asked. "Marcus, to have a voice in your head that was consistently supportive. What would that inner dialogue sound like?" Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering. I guess it would sound like how I talk to my own kids. When they mess up, I don't tear them down. I help them figure out how to do better next time. When they succeed, I celebrate with them. I tell them I'm proud of them all the time because I want them to know it." "So you already know how to be the kind of parent you needed," Laura observed. "You've broken the cycle with your own children." "Yeah, I guess I have." Marcus looked surprised by this realization. "I never thought about it that way." The session continued, but Laura found herself thinking about cycles and choices, about the ways people either perpetuated or interrupted the patterns they inherited from their families. She thought about her own mother, who had broken the cycle of her own childhood by choosing to love unconditionally rather than withhold affection as punishment. She thought about Margaret, who seemed determined to pass down her own twisted version of family loyalty to the next generation. Her final client of the day was Sarah, a 28-year-old teacher who was struggling with her decision to go no contact with her emotionally abusive parents. Sarah's story was particularly relevant. She had grown up in a wealthy family where love came with conditions, where approval had to be earned through compliance, where any attempt at independence was met with threats of disinheritance and rejection. "No, I'm making the right choice," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "I know that cutting them off is the only way to protect my mental health, but it still feels like I'm abandoning them, like I'm being selfish." "Can you tell me more about what selfish means to you?" Laura asked. "Putting my own needs first, choosing my peace over their feelings, refusing to sacrifice my well-being to keep the family together. And what would you call it if you stayed in contact and continued to accept their abuse?" Sarah was quiet for a moment. "Self-destructive, I guess. Harmful to my marriage, to my ability to be a good teacher, to my plans to have children someday." "So, you're choosing between being selfish in a way that allows you to be healthy and present for the people who matter to you, or being selfless in a way that damages your ability to contribute positively to the world. Is that accurate? When you put it that way," Sarah wiped her eyes with a tissue, "it doesn't sound selfish at all. It sounds responsible." After Sarah left, Laura sat in her office for an extra 20 minutes, thinking about responsibility and protection, about the difference between family loyalty and family toxicity. She thought about the conversation waiting for her at home, about the choices she would need to make to protect her daughter from the kind of conditional love that had damaged so many of her clients. The drive home was unusually quiet. She had turned off the radio and let herself think in silence, feeling the baby's gentle movements as a reminder of what was at stake. By the time she pulled into her driveway, she had made several decisions that would reshape her family's future. David was in the kitchen when she arrived, standing at the counter with his back to the door. His shoulders were tense, and she could tell from his posture that he had been thinking as much as she had over the past 3 days. "How was work?" he asked without turning around. "Enlightening," Laura replied, setting her bag on the table and moving to stand beside him. "How was yours?" "Complicated." He finally looked at her, and she was surprised to see that he looked older somehow, as if the events of Sunday had aged him in a way that 3 days shouldn't have been able to accomplish. "I've been thinking about what my mother said, about what it means, about what I should have done differently." Laura waited, using the same patient silence she employed with her clients when they needed space to work through difficult thoughts. "I should have stopped her," David continued. "The moment she opened her mouth, I should have shut it down. I should have protected you, protected our daughter. Instead, I just stood there like an idiot, waiting for someone else to fix it." "And why do you think you did that?" Laura asked gently. David laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Because I've been doing it my whole life. Standing there while she says horrible things, telling myself it's just how she is, that it's easier to let her have her way than to fight with her. I've been enabling her behavior for 34 years. This was the longest and most insightful conversation they had ever had about Margaret's impact on their relationship. Usually, David deflected or made excuses or changed the subject. The fact that he was finally seeing clearly was encouraging, but Laura knew that recognition was only the first step in a much longer process. "What does that mean for us going forward?" she asked. David was quiet for a long time, long enough that the baby seemed to respond to the tension by becoming very still. Finally, he spoke. "It means things have to change. I can't keep expecting you to tolerate her abuse just because she's my mother. I can't keep prioritizing her feelings over your safety, over our daughter's well-being." "What does that look like practically?" "I don't know yet," David admitted. "But I know it starts with me calling her and telling her that what she said was unacceptable, that she needs to apologize to you, and that until she does, she's not welcome in our home or around our child." Laura felt something loosen in her chest, a tension she hadn't even realized she was carrying. This was more than she had expected from David, more than she had dared to hope for. "And if she refuses to apologize?" she asked. "Then she doesn't get to be part of our daughter's life until she changes her mind." They talked for another hour, working through the practical implications of setting boundaries with Margaret, discussing how to handle family events and holidays, planning for the possibility that other family members might take sides. It was a difficult conversation, but it was also the most honest communication they had shared in months. Later that evening, as Laura lay in bed with her hand on her belly, she found herself thinking about the kind of mother she wanted to be. She thought about her clients who were still healing from childhood wounds in their 30s and 40s, about the way family dysfunction could echo across decades if left unchecked. She thought about Elena, who was probably celebrating her successful thesis defense while simultaneously dealing with her family's mixed reactions to her achievement. She thought about Marcus, who was learning to replace his father's critical voice with something more compassionate. She thought about Sarah, who was choosing her own well-being over her family's dysfunction, even though it meant sacrificing relationships she had hoped could be repaired. All of these people were doing the hard work of breaking cycles, of choosing health over history, of protecting themselves and their future families from the patterns that had been passed down to them, and now it was Laura's turn to make the same kinds of choices. The baby kicked, as if agreeing with her thoughts, and Laura smiled in the darkness. "Your daddy is going to have a difficult conversation with your grandmother tomorrow," she whispered, And depending on how that goes, you might grow up with one less grandparent but a lot more peace. That's a trade I'm willing to make." She fell asleep thinking about the nursery they had been decorating, about the books they would read together, about the kinds of conversations she wanted to have with her daughter, about self-worth and boundaries, and the difference between family and blood relations. Outside, the world continued its nightly routine. Streetlights flickered on, neighbors settled into their evening rituals, the ordinary business of life carried forward without acknowledgement of the profound changes happening. Inside one house on Maple Street, but inside, in the quiet space between sleeping and waking, a mother and daughter were already beginning the process of building something new together, something that would prove to be stronger than they could have imagined. The phone call between David and his mother lasted exactly 14 minutes and 37 seconds. Laura knew this because she sat in the living room, timing it on her phone while trying to read a book on infant development that Maya had given her. She could hear David's voice rising and falling in the kitchen, could catch fragments of phrases like completely unacceptable and need to understand and our daughter's well-being. Margaret's voice carried through the phone loud enough that, even from the next room, Laura could hear the cold precision of her responses. There was something almost surgical about the way Margaret wielded silence, letting David speak until he ran out of momentum, then delivering her counterarguments with the kind of clinical detachment that made her such an effective psychiatrist, and such a devastating mother-in-law. When David finally hung up, the silence that followed felt different from the comfortable quiet that usually filled their home in the evenings. This was the heavy silence that comes after bridge burning, after ultimatums are delivered and lines are drawn in sand that has suddenly turned to concrete. "How did it go?" Laura asked when David appeared in the doorway, his face pale and his hand shaking slightly. "About as well as you'd expect," he replied, sinking into the chair across from her. "She's not going to apologize. She says she was speaking honestly about her concerns for our family's future, and that expecting her to apologize for telling the truth is emotional manipulation." Laura felt the baby kick, as if responding to the spike in her stress hormones. "Did you tell her about the consequences?" "I did. I told her that until she apologizes to you and commits to treating you with basic respect, she won't be welcome in our home or around our daughter." David ran his hands through his hair, a gesture Laura had come to recognize as his way of processing overwhelming emotions. "She laughed, Laura. Actually laughed. She said I was being dramatic and that I'd come to my senses once the baby arrives. And we realize how much we need her help." "And how did you respond to that?" "I told her she was wrong. I told her that our daughter will grow up surrounded by people who love and respect her mother, and that anyone who can't meet that basic requirement won't be part of her life." Laura reached across the space between their chairs and took his hand. His palm was damp with perspiration, but his grip was firm. "I'm proud of you," she said quietly. "I know that wasn't easy." "It was the hardest conversation I've ever had with her," David admitted. "But it was also the clearest I've ever been about what matters most, and what matters most is you and our daughter." They spent the rest of the evening planning for what came next. There would be family members to notify, holiday plans to revise, practical considerations about childcare and emergency contacts. David's relationship with his mother had been the gravitational center around which many family dynamics revolved, and removing that relationship would require rebuilding entire social systems. But what they couldn't have predicted was how quickly the news would spread, or how many people had been waiting for someone to finally stand up to Margaret Whitmore. The first call came the next morning from David's Aunt Patricia, his father's sister who had been at the gender reveal party. "I've been thinking about what happened on Sunday," Patricia said without preamble when David answered the phone. "And I wanted you to know that Robert and I support your decision completely." "My decision?" "To cut contact with Margaret until she apologizes. Word travels fast in this family, and frankly, it's about time someone held her accountable for the way she treats people." David put the phone on speaker so Laura could hear, and they listened as Patricia continued. "Your mother has been saying, cruel things to family members for years. But she's always gotten away with it because she's a doctor, because she has money, because she knows how to make her victims feel like they're the problem. What she said to Laura was just the most public example of behavior that's been going on for decades. Patricia went on to share stories that David had never heard, about Margaret's treatment of other family members' spouses, about the way she had tried to sabotage relationships she deemed unsuitable, about the careful psychological warfare she waged against anyone who threatened her control over the family narrative. "Your cousin Emma called me crying last night," Patricia continued. "She said listening to Margaret wish for a miscarriage triggered something in her about her own pregnancy anxiety. Emma's been worried for months about whether she's good enough to be a mother, and hearing Margaret talked that way about an unborn child just confirmed her worst fears about how judgmental this family can be." The second call came that afternoon from David's brother Michael, who lived in Seattle with his partner James. "I saw the video," Michael said as soon as David picked up. "What video?" Jessica posted the gender reveal on her Instagram story. "The whole thing, including what Mom said. It's been viewed over 10,000 times in the last 24 hours. Laura felt her stomach drop. She had forgotten about Jessica recording the party, had never considered that the footage might end up online. "Most of the comments are supportive of you guys," Michael continued quickly, as if sensing their panic. "People are horrified by what Mom said, but there are also people sharing their own stories about toxic family members, about in-laws who tried to sabotage their pregnancies, about grandparents who rejected grandchildren for not meeting their expectations." "How bad is it?" David asked. "For Mom? Pretty bad. Someone identified her as Dr. Margaret Whitmore from her psychiatric practice, and now people are questioning whether someone who talks about miscarriages that way should be treating patients with mental health issues. There are calls for the medical board to investigate her professional conduct." Laura had spent enough time in the mental health field to understand the implications. Patient complaints about a therapist's character could trigger ethics investigations, license reviews, and public scrutiny that could end a career. "But honestly," Michael continued, "I think it's long overdue. Do you know what she said to James when we got engaged? She told me I was making a lifestyle choice that would embarrass the family, and that I shouldn't expect anyone to pretend to be happy about it. When I told her that James was the love of my life, she said love wasn't enough to overcome the social consequences of my decisions." This was news to David. Michael had never mentioned any conflict with their mother about his sexuality or his relationship with James. Like so many family secrets, Margaret's cruelty had been compartmentalized, experienced in isolation by each victim who assumed they were the only one being targeted. The third call came from Jessica herself, who was sobbing, so hard that they could barely understand her. "I'm so sorry," she kept repeating. "I didn't mean for this to happen. I just posted it without thinking. And now it's everywhere, and people are saying terrible things about our family." But as Jessica continued talking, it became clear that she wasn't just sorry about the video going viral. She was sorry about years of enabling Margaret's behavior, about staying silent when she witnessed cruelty, about participating in a family system that protected the perpetrator at the expense of her victims. "I've been thinking about it ever since Sunday," Jessica said, "about all the times I watched her tear people down and told myself it wasn't my business, about how I used to joke that she was just being Margaret when she said horrible things. I was complicit, and I'm ashamed of that." By the end of the week, the video had been shared on multiple social media platforms, featured in several online articles about family dysfunction and toxic in-laws, and generated hundreds of comments from people sharing their own experiences with conditional family love. Someone had created a hashtag, hoping for miscarriage, that was being used to document stories of family members who had expressed similar sentiments about pregnancies that didn't meet their approval. Dr. Margaret Whitmore found herself at the center of a social media storm that was beginning to affect her professional life. Several patients had canceled appointments after seeing the video, citing concerns about her ability to provide compassionate care. The medical center where she practiced had received dozens of complaints and inquiries about her fitness to treat. patients dealing with pregnancy loss, fertility struggles, and family planning issues. But the story was resonating beyond social media. Laura began receiving messages from strangers who had found her contact information online. Women who had experienced similar rejection from family members, therapists who wanted to share resources for dealing with toxic family dynamics, researchers studying intergenerational trauma who were interested in her professional perspective on the situation. The most unexpected contact came from Dr. Rachel Martinez, a psychology professor at the State University who specialized in family systems therapy. Dr. Martinez had seen the video and recognized something significant in the way the family dynamics played out in such a public setting. "I've been studying toxic family patterns for 15 years, Dr. Martinez explained during their phone conversation. "And what happened at your gender reveal is a perfect case study in how family scapegoating operates. Your mother-in-law didn't just express a preference. She performed a ritual of exclusion designed to establish dominance and test family loyalty." Dr. Martinez went on to explain how Margaret's public statement served multiple psychological functions. It positioned her as the family authority who determined which members were acceptable, it forced other family members to choose sides, and it created shame and isolation for the target. The fact that it happened at a celebration made it even more psychologically devastating. "The gender reveal setting was particularly insidious," Dr. Martinez continued. "She weaponized what should have been a moment of joy and used it to deliver maximum emotional damage. That level of calculated cruelty suggests someone who understands psychological manipulation at a very sophisticated level." As a mental health professional herself, Laura found these conversations both validating and disturbing. She had recognized the manipulation tactics intellectually, but hearing them analyzed by other experts helped her understand the full scope of what she and her daughter had been targeted with. Meanwhile, the responses from David's extended family continued to reveal the extent of Margaret's impact over the years. David's cousin Robert Jr. called to share that he had never introduced his girlfriend to the family because he was afraid of how Margaret would treat her. David's Aunt Sarah admitted that she had avoided family gatherings for years because Margaret consistently made comments about her weight, her career choices, and her decision to remain single. "It's like she had a file on everyone," Sarah explained. "She knew exactly what each person was most insecure about, and she would find ways to poke at those insecurities whenever she wanted to maintain control or punish someone for not conforming to her expectations." The pattern that emerged was one of systematic emotional abuse disguised as family concern. Margaret had positioned herself as the keeper of family standards, the arbiter of acceptability, the voice of difficult truths that others were too weak or deluded to acknowledge. And for years, family members had enabled this dynamic by staying silent, making excuses, and redirecting their anger toward her victims rather than confronting her behavior directly. But the gender reveal video had done something unprecedented. It had made Margaret's cruelty visible to outsiders, subjecting her methods to public scrutiny and community judgment. For the first time in decades, she was facing consequences for behavior that had previously been protected by family loyalty and social status. The professional consequences began to mount. The State Medical Board launched an investigation into Margaret's conduct after receiving multiple complaints questioning her fitness to practice. Several of her colleagues at the medical center distanced themselves from her, citing concerns about the ethics of her public statements. A local newspaper picked up the story, running an article about social media accountability and professional responsibility that featured Margaret's case prominently. Most significantly, 3 of Margaret's current patients came forward to file formal complaints about her treatment approach, citing the video as evidence of attitudes that had affected their therapy experiences. One patient, a young mother struggling with postpartum depression, described feeling judged and criticized during sessions rather than supported. Another patient, a teenager dealing with family conflict, reported that Margaret had consistently sided with parental authority figures regardless of the circumstances, making the teen feel unheard and invalidated. These complaints triggered a formal ethics review that would examine not just Margaret's public statements, but her entire approach to patient care over the past several years. The investigation would take months to complete, but the immediate effect was a suspension of her license pending the outcome of the review. For someone whose identity had been built around professional status and social position, the public scrutiny was devastating. Margaret's carefully constructed image as a respected medical professional and family matriarch was crumbling in real time, and she seemed genuinely shocked that actions she had never been held accountable for were suddenly having serious consequences. The irony wasn't lost on Laura that Margaret's own profession was now being used to analyze and critique her behavior. Multiple therapists and psychologists had weighed in on the video, explaining concepts like emotional abuse, family scapegoating, and toxic family systems to audiences who were hungry to understand the dynamics they had witnessed. Dr. James Chen, a prominent family therapist with a large social media following, created an educational video using Margaret's statements as examples of manipulative language patterns. He broke down the psychological techniques embedded in her words, the false concern, the character assassination disguised as truth-telling, the attempt to isolate the victim by questioning their worthiness of family membership. When someone says they're hoping for a miscarriage at a baby celebration, Dr. Chen explained to his audience, they're not expressing a genuine concern for the family's well-being. They're performing a power play designed to establish dominance and create shame. This is psychological abuse in its most refined form. The educational content was being shared widely, helping people recognize similar patterns in their own families and relationships. Comment sections filled with stories of viewers who were finally able to name and understand dynamics they had experienced but never fully comprehended. But perhaps the most powerful response came from an unexpected source. Margaret's own former patients, who began reaching out to each other through online support groups and social media connections. They discovered that many of them had similar experiences in therapy with her, feeling criticized rather than supported, having their concerns dismissed or minimized, being told that their problems were caused by their own failure to accept family dysfunction as normal. A private Facebook group called Dr. Whitmore Survivors grew to over 200 members within a month. Members shared their therapy experiences, compared notes about Margaret's treatment approach, and supported each other in processing the validation that came from realizing they weren't alone in their negative experiences with her professional services. The group's conversations revealed a pattern of therapeutic malpractice that went far beyond inappropriate public statements. Margaret had apparently been using her therapy sessions to reinforce toxic family dynamics rather than helping patients develop healthy boundaries. She had consistently blamed patients for their family conflicts, encouraged them to accept abuse as love, and pathologized their attempts to protect themselves from harmful relationships. One former patient, a woman named Jennifer who had seen Margaret for help with depression following her divorce, shared her story with the local newspaper. I went to Dr. Whitmore because I was struggling with my ex-husband's emotional abuse and my family's pressure to reconcile with him. Instead of helping me heal, she spent our sessions convincing me that I was being too sensitive, that marriage required sacrifice, and that my children would be damaged if I didn't find a way to make the relationship work. I left therapy feeling worse about myself than when I started. Another former patient described how Margaret had consistently dismissed her concerns about her mother's manipulative behavior, insisting that family loyalty required accepting her mother's treatment as an expression of love. The patient had spent years believing that her desire for respect and kindness from her mother was unreasonable and selfish. These revelations transformed Margaret from a respected professional who had made one public mistake into someone whose entire career was built on perpetuating the same toxic dynamics she demonstrated at the gender reveal party. The video hadn't captured an isolated incident. It had provided a window into a systematic pattern of behavior that had been harming vulnerable people for decades. As the investigation into her professional conduct deepened, more evidence emerged of Margaret's inappropriate therapeutic practices. Case notes revealed a consistent pattern of victim blaming, family system reinforcement regardless of dysfunction levels, and therapeutic interventions that prioritized maintaining family hierarchies over patient well-being. The state medical board's investigation expanded to include a comprehensive review of Margaret's patient files, interviews with former patients and colleagues, and an examination of her continuing education records to determine whether her therapeutic approaches met current, professional standards. Meanwhile, the social media storm continued to grow. The video had been featured on several major news programs as an example of family dysfunction going viral, and Margaret's case was being discussed in professional journals and conferences as a cautionary tale about the intersection of personal behavior and professional responsibility. But for Laura and David, the most significant development was happening much closer to home. The extended family had split into clear factions: those who supported Margaret and viewed her public humiliation as unfair persecution, and those who saw the situation as long overdue accountability for decades of harmful behavior. David's father, Robert, found himself in an impossible position. Married to Margaret for 37 years, he had built his life around managing her personality and minimizing her impact on others. The public scrutiny of his wife's behavior forced him to confront dynamics he had spent decades avoiding. "I've been making excuses for her for so long that I forgot they were excuses," Robert admitted to David during a difficult phone conversation. "I told myself she was just direct, that she had high standards, that people were too sensitive. But watching that video, hearing what she said about your wife and your baby, I can't pretend anymore that this is normal behavior." Robert's awakening was painful to witness. He was a gentleman who had spent most of his marriage serving as a buffer between Margaret and the rest of the world, absorbing her cruelty so that others wouldn't have to experience it directly. The realization that his protection hadn't been enough, that Margaret's toxicity had been leaking out and poisoning family relationships for years, left him questioning fundamental assumptions about his life and marriage. The most heartbreaking moment came when Robert asked David a question that revealed the depth of his own damage. "Do you think she ever really loved any of us? Or were we all just props in her performance of being a successful family?" David couldn't answer that question because he was grappling with it himself. Looking back at his childhood with new clarity, he could see how Margaret's love had always been conditional, how her approval had to be earned through compliance, how any attempt at independence had been met with punishment disguised as concern. But the investigation and public scrutiny were also revealing something else: the extent to which Margaret's behavior had been enabled by a system that privileged professional status and social position over accountability. Her colleagues had ignored red flags, family members had stayed silent about her cruelty, and institutions had protected her reputation rather than investigating complaints. The gender reveal video had done more than expose one woman's toxicity. It had illuminated an entire network of enablement and complicity that had allowed that toxicity to flourish unchecked for decades. As Laura entered her third trimester, feeling her daughter's movements becoming stronger and more frequent, she found herself thinking about the world they were bringing her into. It was a world where cruelty could be exposed and consequences could follow, where victims could find each other and support each other, where professional standards could be enforced and toxic behavior could be challenged. It was also a world where her daughter would grow up knowing that her parents had chosen her well-being over family peace, had chosen truth over convenience, had chosen love over loyalty to people who couldn't love them back in healthy ways. The pink confetti from the gender reveal had long since been cleaned up from Margaret's lawn. But the ripple effects of that moment continued to spread, touching lives in ways that none of them could have predicted, creating changes that would reshape not just one family, but an entire community's understanding of what family relationships could and should look like. The call that changed everything came on a Tuesday morning in November, 3 weeks before Laura's due date. She was in her office, finishing up paperwork before beginning her maternity leave, when her phone rang with a number she didn't recognize. Ms. Whitmore. This is Detective Sarah Morrison with the State Medical Board Investigative Unit. I was wondering if you had time to discuss some information that's come to light during our investigation of Dr. Margaret Whitmore. Laura's hand instinctively moved to her belly, where the baby was resting quietly after an active morning of kicks and rolls. What kind of information? We've received some documentation that suggests Dr. Whitmore may have been inappropriately accessing confidential medical records. Given your connection to the family and your professional background, we'd like to get your perspective on some concerning patterns we've identified. The meeting took place that afternoon in a sterile conference room at the medical board offices. Detective Morrison was a middle-aged woman with kind eyes and the efficient manner of someone who had spent years investigating professional misconduct. She spread several documents across the table with the practiced movements of someone revealing evidence. What we're about to show you is confidential pending the completion of our investigation, Detective Morrison began. But we believe you have a right to know about this, given that it directly affects you and your family. The first document was a printout of medical records access logs from the hospital system where Margaret had privileges. The logs showed that Margaret had accessed Laura's medical records multiple times over the past year, including detailed information about her fertility treatments, pregnancy tests, and prenatal appointments. She accessed your records without authorization on 47 separate occasions, Detective Morrison explained. The pattern suggests she was monitoring your reproductive health in detail, including information that would have allowed her to know about your pregnancy before you announced it publicly. Laura felt sick. The violation was profound and deeply personal. Margaret had been watching, waiting, gathering information that she then used to craft her cruel response to the pregnancy announcement. But that was just the beginning. The second set of documents showed that Margaret had accessed the medical records of multiple family members over the years. David's brother, Michael's HIV prevention medications, his cousin Emma's fertility treatments, his Aunt Sarah's mental health prescriptions. She had been conducting unauthorized surveillance of her entire extended family's medical information. This represents a systematic violation of patient privacy rights, Detective Morrison continued. But what's particularly concerning is how she appears to have used this information. The third revelation was the most disturbing. Margaret had been keeping detailed notes about family members' medical information, personal relationships, and vulnerabilities. These notes, found during a search of her office computer, read like intelligence files designed to maximize psychological damage. About Michael. HIV anxiety provides leverage, can suggest lifestyle consequences if he challenges family decisions. About Emma. Fertility struggles make her defensive about reproductive choices, can be triggered by pregnancy discussions. About Laura. Background of poverty and single motherhood creates insecurity about worthiness, can be isolated from family by emphasizing class differences. The notes revealed a level of calculated manipulation that went far beyond garden variety. Family dysfunction. Margaret had been systematically gathering information about her family members' deepest insecurities and medical vulnerabilities, then weaponizing that information to maintain control over family dynamics. Dr. Whitmore appears to have been conducting unauthorized psychological profiles of family members and using confidential medical information to enhance her ability to manipulate them, Detective Morrison explained. This represents not just a violation of medical privacy laws, but a form of systematic emotional abuse that she was able to perfect through her professional access to sensitive information. Laura thought about all the times Margaret had seemed to know exactly what to say to cause maximum psychological damage. The pinpoint accuracy of her cruelty, the way she could identify and target each person's specific vulnerabilities, the uncanny timing of her most devastating attacks. It hadn't been intuition or psychological training. It had been intelligence gathering and strategic planning. What does this mean for her medical license? Laura asked. The unauthorized access to medical records is a federal crime under HIPAA laws, Detective Morrison replied. She's facing criminal charges as well as professional sanctions. Her medical license has already been permanently revoked, and she'll likely face significant fines and possible jail time. But the investigation had revealed even more disturbing information. Margaret had been using her access to hospital computer systems to research information about her therapy patients' family members, gathering ammunition for her therapeutic interventions that prioritized family system maintenance over patient well-being. We found evidence that she was accessing medical records of her patients' relatives without authorization, then using that information to manipulate therapy sessions, Detective Morrison continued. For example, she would know about a patient's mother's psychiatric medications and use that information to argue that the patient's complaints about family dysfunction were unreasonable since the mother was getting treatment for her issues. The scope of Margaret's misconduct was staggering. She had turned her medical access into a tool for psychological warfare, conducting surveillance on dozens of people and using their most private health information to damage their relationships and undermine their sense of reality. "How did you discover all of this?" Laura asked. "The initial investigation into her public conduct led us to examine her professional practices more closely," Detective Morrison explained. "When we audited her computer access logs, we found patterns that didn't match legitimate medical reasons for accessing those records. The investigation snowballed from there." As Detective Morrison packed up the documents, she handed Laura a business card. "You and your family members are victims of serious crimes. You have the right to pursue civil litigation, and the district attorney's office will be in contact about the criminal proceedings. You also have the right to victim services and counseling support." Laura drove home in a daze, trying to process the magnitude of what she had learned. Margaret's cruelty hadn't just been the result of personality disorders or family dysfunction. It had been a systematic campaign of psychological abuse enabled by criminal violations of medical privacy laws. When she told David that evening, his reaction was unlike anything she had ever seen from him. He didn't express anger or shock or dismay. Instead, he seemed to deflate, as if some final illusion had been punctured, and he was finally seeing his mother with complete clarity. "It explains so much," he said quietly. "All those times she seemed to know exactly what to say to hurt people the most. All those times her timing was perfect for maximum damage. She wasn't just emotionally abusive. She was conducting reconnaissance." They called the other family members who had been targeted by Margaret's surveillance. Each conversation revealed new layers of violation and manipulation. Michael realized that Margaret's knowledge of his medical information explained why she had been able to weaponize his HIV prevention protocols during family arguments. Emma understood why Margaret had always seemed to know exactly when to make comments about fertility and pregnancy that would trigger her deepest anxieties. But perhaps the most devastating revelation came from David's father, Robert, who discovered that Margaret had been accessing his medical records for over a decade, monitoring his heart medication, his cholesterol levels, and his mental health prescriptions. "She knew about my anxiety medication," Robert told David over the phone, his voice barely above a whisper. "She knew I was struggling with depression, and instead of supporting me, she used that information to manipulate me. When I would try to stand up to her or protect other family members from her behavior, she would suggest that my medications were affecting my judgment, that I was being unstable or over-emotional." The realization that his wife had been using his private medical information to gaslight him and undermine his efforts to protect others from her abuse was shattering for Robert. He had spent years believing that his perceptions of her behavior might be distorted by his mental health struggles, never knowing that she was deliberately fostering that doubt by weaponizing his confidential medical information. The criminal charges were filed 3 days later. Margaret was arrested at her home and charged with 47 counts of unauthorized access to medical records, multiple counts of identity theft, and federal HIPAA violations. The local newspaper covered the arrest with a detailed article explaining how the gender reveal video had led to the discovery of systematic criminal behavior. The article included statements from several of Margaret's former patients, who described how their therapy experiences now made sense in light of the revelation that she had been accessing their family members' medical records without authorization. Many reported feeling manipulated and psychologically violated, not just by her therapeutic approach, but by the realization that she had been operating with information she shouldn't have possessed. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a colleague of Margaret's, who had worked with her for over a decade, spoke to the newspaper about the shock of discovering the extent of her misconduct. Margaret was always very knowledgeable about her patients' family dynamics, Dr. Walsh explained. We assumed it was because she was skilled at gathering information during sessions. We never suspected that she was illegally accessing medical records to enhance her psychological profiles of entire family systems. The professional community's response was swift and decisive. The hospital where Margaret had privileges immediately terminated her access and launched an internal investigation of their computer security protocols. The medical center where she had practiced sent letters to all of her former patients, offering free counseling services to help them process the revelation that their therapy may have been compromised by illegally obtained information. Several professional organizations issued statements condemning Margaret's behavior and using her case as an example of how professional privileges could be abused to harm vulnerable individuals. The American Psychological Association published an article in their newsletter examining the ethical implications of using unauthorized medical information to manipulate therapy outcomes. But for Laura and David, the most important response came from family members who had been targeted by Margaret's systematic abuse. One by one, they began reaching out to apologize for years of enabling her behavior, for staying silent when they witnessed her cruelty, for participating in a family system that protected the abuser at the expense of her victims. David's cousin, Robert Jr., called to apologize for never introducing his girlfriend to the family, because he was afraid of Margaret's judgment. I let her control my relationships through fear, he admitted. And by doing that, I was helping her maintain power over all of us. Emma sent a lengthy email describing her own experiences with Margaret's manipulation during her fertility struggles. She knew things about my medical treatments that I had never told her, Emma wrote. She would make comments that were so specifically targeted to my insecurities that I thought she must be some kind of mind reader. Now I know she was just a criminal. The most powerful apology came from Jessica, who had recorded the gender reveal video. She drove to Laura and David's house to deliver it in person, tears streaming down her face as she explained how the investigation had opened her eyes to her own complicity in Margaret's abuse. I knew she was cruel, Jessica said. I knew she said things that hurt people, but I told myself it wasn't my business, that families are complicated, that people needed to learn to stand up for themselves. I never realized that she was using stolen medical information to target people's deepest vulnerabilities. I never understood that she was conducting psychological warfare with criminal tools. Jessica went on to explain how she had spent her entire adult life walking on eggshells around Margaret, modifying her behavior and choices to avoid becoming a target of her disapproval. I changed my major in college because she made comments about my chosen field being unsuitable for someone from our family background. I broke up with a boyfriend I loved because she convinced me that he was using me for my family connections. I gave her power over my life by believing that her judgment was somehow more valid than my own feelings. The apologies were meaningful, but they also highlighted the extensive damage that Margaret's systematic abuse had caused over the years. Relationships had been destroyed, life choices had been altered, and multiple people had spent years doubting their own perceptions of reality because they were being manipulated by someone with access to information they shouldn't have possessed. As Laura entered her final weeks of pregnancy, she found herself processing not just the immediate violations she had experienced, but the broader implications of what Margaret's behavior revealed about the ways professional power could be abused to harm vulnerable people. Her training as a therapist had taught her about the importance of boundaries, consent, and confidentiality in therapeutic relationships. But Margaret's case demonstrated how those same professional privileges could be weaponized by someone willing to violate basic ethical principles in service of personal control and manipulation. The baby seemed to respond to her mother's emotional processing by becoming more active, as if sensing that major changes were occurring in the world she was about to enter. Laura found herself talking to her daughter about the importance of recognizing manipulation, setting boundaries, and protecting herself from people who would use private information to cause harm. You're going to grow up in a world where your private medical information is protected by law, she whispered during one of their evening conversations. You're going to grow up knowing that love doesn't require you to accept abuse, and that family relationships should make you feel safe, not surveilled. The criminal trial was scheduled for the following spring, after the baby's birth. Margaret had been released on bail, but was required to surrender her passport and was prohibited from accessing any medical computer systems. Her professional life was effectively over, her reputation was destroyed, and she was facing the possibility of significant jail time. But perhaps most significantly, her systematic abuse of family members had been exposed and documented in ways that made denial impossible. The family members who had enabled her behavior by staying silent or making excuses were now forced to confront the reality of what they had allowed to continue for decades. The investigation had revealed a truth that was more devastating than anyone had imagined. Margaret's cruelty hadn't been the result of psychological dysfunction or family dynamics gone wrong. It had been a calculated campaign of abuse, enhanced by criminal violations of medical privacy, designed to maintain control over other people's lives through the strategic deployment of their most private vulnerabilities. As Laura prepared for the birth of her daughter, she felt a profound sense of gratitude that the truth had emerged before her child was born into Margaret's sphere of influence. Her daughter would grow up in a family where boundaries were respected, where love was unconditional, where private information was protected, and where anyone who violated those principles would face immediate and decisive consequences. The pink confetti had started it all, but the investigation had revealed something far more significant than one moment of public cruelty. It had exposed a systematic pattern of criminal abuse that had been hiding behind professional respectability and family loyalty for decades. And now, finally, there would be accountability. Grace Elena Whitmore was born on December 15th at 3:47 a.m., weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, with her father's dark hair and what the nurses insisted were her mother's determined eyes. Laura held her daughter for the first time in a quiet hospital room decorated with flowers from friends and colleagues, surrounded by people who had chosen to love and support them through the most challenging year of their lives. Maya was there, of course, having driven through a snowstorm to make sure she didn't miss the birth of her goddaughter. David's father, Robert, was there too, still processing his own divorce proceedings, but committed to being the kind of grandfather his son's family deserved. David's Aunt Patricia and Uncle Robert had come, along with Emma and her own 3-month-old son, creating a small celebration of the family they were choosing to build together. Margaret was not there. She would never be there. The criminal trial had concluded 2 weeks before Grace's birth, resulting in Margaret's conviction on all charges. She had been sentenced to 2 years in federal prison for the HIPAA violations and medical record theft, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. Her medical license had been permanently revoked, her professional reputation was destroyed, and she was required to pay substantial restitution to the dozens of family members and patients whose privacy she had violated. But more significantly, the trial had generated national attention about the intersection of professional power and domestic abuse. Margaret's case had become a cautionary tale about how medical access could be weaponized for psychological manipulation, leading to new protocols and oversight mechanisms designed to prevent similar violations in the future. The media coverage had been extensive but respectful, focusing on the systemic issues rather than sensationalizing the family drama. Several major news outlets had interviewed Laura about her experience, and she had used those platforms to advocate for stronger protections for victims of professional misconduct and clearer boundaries around medical privacy rights. What people need to understand, Laura had explained during one television interview, her pregnant belly visible as she spoke to the camera, is that this wasn't just about family dysfunction or personal conflicts. This was about someone using professional privileges to systematically abuse vulnerable people, including her own family members. When we allow that kind of behavior to continue unchecked, we're not just enabling individual abusers, we're undermining the trust that our entire healthcare system depends on. The interview had been viewed over 2 million times and had generated hundreds of comments from people sharing their own experiences with professional boundary violations and family abuse. Laura's calm, educational approach to discussing the situation had helped frame the conversation around systemic problems rather than personal drama, creating space for productive discussions about how to prevent similar violations in the future. Now, holding Grace in her arms while snowflakes drifted past the hospital window, Laura felt a profound sense of completion. The past year had been a journey through exposure and accountability, through family reconstruction and boundary setting, through the painful but necessary work of choosing health over history. "She's perfect," Robert whispered, leaning over to stroke his granddaughter's tiny hand. His own journey over the past year had been remarkable to witness. From enabler to ally, from confusion to clarity, from passive participant to active protector. The divorce from Margaret had been difficult, but liberating, allowing him to rebuild relationships with family members he had spent decades watching her abuse. "She looks like David did when he was born," Robert continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But I hope she grows up feeling safer in this family than he did." David was holding his daughter with the careful intensity of someone who understood exactly what he was protecting her from. The past year had transformed him from a conflict-avoidant people-pleaser into someone who could set boundaries with surgical precision. He had testified at his mother's trial with unflinching honesty, describing years of manipulation and abuse that he had previously minimized or excused. "She's going to grow up knowing that she's wanted," David said quietly, looking down at Grace's sleeping face. "She's going to grow up knowing that the adults in her life will protect her, not use her vulnerabilities against her." Maya was documenting everything with her camera, but these pictures would serve a different purpose than the infamous gender reveal video. These would be evidence of joy, of chosen family, of love without conditions. They would be the first entry in a photo album that would tell a story of protection and celebration, rather than manipulation and cruelty. The hospital stay was peaceful in ways that Laura hadn't expected. There were no complicated family dynamics to navigate, no difficult conversations to avoid, no walking on eggshells around people who might weaponize moments of vulnerability. There was just the simple, profound experience of welcoming a new person into a family that had been carefully curated to prioritize her well-being. The flowers kept arriving, from Laura's colleagues at the mental health center, from former clients who had heard about the birth, from strangers who had followed their story and wanted to celebrate Grace's arrival. Each arrangement represented a community of support that had formed around their family's decision to prioritize boundaries and accountability over family peace and social expectations. Dr. Martinez, the psychology professor who had first analyzed Margaret's behavior, sent a beautiful orchid arrangement with a card that read, "Congratulations on bringing Grace into a family that chose love over loyalty to toxicity. She is lucky to have parents who understand the difference." The card that moved Laura to tears came from Elena Rodriguez, her former client who had successfully defended her thesis and was now working as a social worker with immigrant families. "Dear Laura," Elena had written, "thank you for showing me what it looks like when someone chooses their child's well-being over family expectations. Watching you set boundaries and hold people accountable gave me permission to do the same in my own life. Grace is so lucky to have a mother who understands that love requires protection, not just acceptance. The note was accompanied by a small, wooden rattle that Elena had carved herself, painted with intricate flowers and Grace's initials. It was a gift from one survivor to another, from someone who understood the courage required to break family patterns and create something healthier for the next generation. On their second day in the hospital, they received an unexpected visitor. Detective Morrison, who had led the investigation into Margaret's crimes, stopped by during her lunch break to meet Grace and check on the family. "I wanted you to know," Detective Morrison said, holding Grace with the practiced ease of someone who had children of her own, "that your case has led to significant policy changes in how medical record access is monitored and audited. Hospital systems across the country are implementing new protocols to prevent the kind of systematic abuse your family experienced." She went on to explain that Margaret's case had become a training example used in medical schools and residency programs to teach about professional boundaries and ethical obligations. The systematic nature of her violations had shocked even experienced investigators, leading to new research into how professional privileges could be abused for personal manipulation. "Your willingness to speak publicly about what happened has helped protect other families from similar violations," Detective Morrison continued. "The legislation that's being introduced next session to strengthen medical privacy protections is being called Grace's Law by the sponsors." Laura felt a complex mixture of pride and sadness. She was proud that their experience could help protect other families, but sad that such protections were necessary in the first place. The fact that professional privileges could be so systematically abused suggested broader problems with oversight and accountability that went far beyond one family's dysfunction. But holding her daughter, surrounded by people who had chosen to support and protect them, Laura felt hopeful about the world Grace would grow up in. It would be a world where professional misconduct faced serious consequences, where family abuse couldn't hide behind social respectability, where victims could find each other and create communities of support and healing. When they brought Grace home 3 days later, the house felt transformed. The nursery they had decorated months earlier now served its intended purpose, welcoming a baby who was wanted and celebrated and protected. The mobile above the crib caught the afternoon light, casting gentle shadows on the walls while Grace slept peacefully in her bassinet. David had taken paternity leave from his law firm, using the time to bond with his daughter and help Laura adjust to the demands of new parenthood. Their days fell into a rhythm of feeding and sleeping and marvel at the tiny person who had joined their family, a rhythm unmarked by the tension and anxiety that had characterized their relationship with Margaret. The absence of that toxicity was almost tangible. There were no worried phone calls about inappropriate visits, no concerns about protecting Grace from cruel comments, no need to monitor conversations for information that might be weaponized later. There was just the ordinary, extraordinary work of caring for a newborn in a home filled with love and security. 2 weeks after Grace's birth, they received a letter from Margaret in prison. David read it first, then handed it to Laura without comment. The letter was a masterpiece of non-apology, filly ears at the gender reveal. His mom announced, "We're hoping for a miscarriage." The therapist's notes went viral. 2 weeks after Grace's birth, they received a letter from Margaret in prison. David read it first, then handed it to Laura without comment. The letter was a masterpiece of non-apology, filled with justifications and victim blaming that demonstrated Margaret's complete inability to accept responsibility for her actions. "I hope you're satisfied with destroying our family," the letter read. "I hope you think it was worth ruining a distinguished career and tearing apart relationships that took decades to build. History will vindicate my concerns about your daughter's future." David crumpled the letter and threw it away without finishing it. "She still doesn't get it," he said quietly. "Even now, even after everything, she thinks she's the victim. But Margaret's inability to change didn't diminish the transformation that had occurred in everyone else's lives. The extended family had rebuilt itself around principles of respect and accountability, rather than silence and enablement. Robert had started dating a kind woman named Helen who treated him with the gentleness he had forgotten he deserved. Michael and James had announced their engagement, planning a wedding that would celebrate love without fear of family judgment. Most significantly, the ripple effects of their story continued to spread. Grace's law passed unanimously in both houses of the state legislature, creating new criminal penalties for medical professionals who accessed patient records for personal rather than medical reasons. The law also established victim services for people whose medical privacy had been violated and created new training requirements for healthcare workers about the ethical use of patient information. The law's passage was celebrated at a small ceremony in the state capitol, where Laura spoke about the importance of protecting vulnerable people from those who would abuse professional power. Grace, now 6 months old, sat quietly in her father's arms, unaware that her existence had catalyzed changes that would protect countless other families from similar violations. Grace will grow up in a world where medical privacy is taken more seriously, where professional misconduct faces swifter consequences, and where family abuse can't hide behind respectability, Laura said to the gathered crowd. That's the legacy we wanted to create from this experience, not just healing for our own family, but protection for others. As Grace babbled happily in David's arms, reaching for the microphone with curious fingers, Laura felt a profound sense of completion. The pink confetti that had started their journey had been transformed into something beautiful and meaningful, a law that would protect other families, a community of support that would nurture their daughter, and a story of accountability that had brought healing to dozens of people who had suffered in silence for too long. The little girl who had been wished away before birth had instead become the catalyst for positive change, proof that love and boundaries could triumph over manipulation and cruelty. Grace Elena Whitmore would grow up knowing that she was wanted, protected, and celebrated, not just by her parents, but by an entire community that had chosen healing over harm. The pink confetti was long gone, but its impact would last for generations. If you enjoyed At the Gender Reveal, his mom announced we're hoping for a miscarriage, you'll love our other true stories that explore the complex relationships that shape our lives. From toxic family dynamics to workplace drama, from unexpected romance to life-changing revelations, we bring you the most captivating real-life stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat.